Bring back your obstetrics and clinical medicine here at University College London, and I'm moderating the session with my co-moderator.
I'm Inya Vandenvijver. I'm from Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas, in the United States.
So thank you for coming along to this session, which is going to be truly exciting because we have two amazing speakers talking about developments in prenatal diagnosis and screening, and then this is followed by four top abstracts. Just to give a little bit of information, please could you all silence your cell phones. There's no photography or recordings permitted in the session, thank you very much. Some of the data might be confidential, so we'd appreciate it if you could not take pictures. And in terms of timing, for those speakers, there's lights down at the front. A green, yellow, red light will show on the podium for the presenter. Green means you're within your time, yellow will appear with 1 minute left, and red will appear when your time is up. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Jim Goldberg from Council. He's currently Chief Medical Officer at Myriad Women's Health. He's board certified in obstetrics and gynecology, maternal fetal medicine, medical genetics, and is a founding fellow of the American College of Medical Genetics. And he's going to talk about carrier screening in the era of expanding genetic technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for that kind introduction, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. Carrier screening is something that I've been interested in for a long time. My actual master's thesis many years ago, actually looking around the audience before many of you were born, was on screening for Tay-Sachs disease, developing a tear assay for that. So I've had a long interest in it. And it's one of the areas where truly advances in genetic technology have really had an impact on how we perform carrier screening and what we can provide to our patients. So hopefully I'll give you a brief overview and present some new data that is yet to be published. My disclosure, I'm a full-time employee of Myriad Women's Health. And Anna mentioned I was with Council. Council no longer exists. It was purchased over the past year by Myriad Women's Health. So kind of sad to see. When I was in practice, many women referred to the carrier screening test as the Council test when it first started out. So it's kind of sad to see that name disappear. One of the things that I wanted to point out is a little bit of historical background for carrier screening. I'm sure many of you have seen in the lay press and even the professional press lately about how overwhelming the choices are for women now who during their pregnancy in terms of genetic testing. And it's interesting to me because when you look back, the choices really haven't changed that much. We've been doing carrier screening for close to 50 years. Tay-Sachs disease, which we'll talk a little bit about, was the model for recessive carrier screening, and aneuploidy screening. So the choices really haven't changed that much. What's changed a lot is that with the application of new genetic technologies, is that screening has gotten better, and now we can provide more choices to our patients. Tay-Sachs disease, as I mentioned, really has been the model for recessive disease, and that's good and bad. I think it really helped set the stage for carrier screening, but things have changed, and I'm going to point that out. The first bullet point on the slide is the Ashkenazi Jewish predilection. That made it easier to identify a target population, and I'll give you some data how that has really changed. Inexpensive carrier tests available, and at the time it was a simple enzyme assay looking at the measurement of hexosaminidase A, so it was relatively inexpensive. And very shortly after O'Brien described that carriers of Tay-Sachs disease had intermediate levels of hexosaminidase A, this was applied for carrier screening. So that's really what led to Mike Hayback starting screening in the Washington-Baltimore area for Tay-Sachs disease and really started the whole whole field of carrier screening. Another thing which was important was the education of the at-risk population, and religious leaders accepted the screening, and that led to wide acceptance among patients. So that was an important piece of the carrier model. And you can see how the impact that has had over the years. If you look on the left in the 1970s at the incidence of Tay-Sachs disease, and then after the onset of carrier screening, you can see how it's dropped precipitously over the years. And the top line, the red line, is in the non-Ashkenazi Jewish population. And one point, and we'll talk more about this, is that the incidence in the non-Ashkenazi Jewish population is actually higher now than the AJ population. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that. First, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about guidelines. And since guidelines, at least in the United States, are what the payers use in many instances to decide what to pay for patients, and what practitioners use to help them figure out what types of testing they should be offering to their patients. And this is a look at the guidelines from the two main professional organizations in the United States, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And you can see they're relatively similar. There's only two diseases that they recommend everyone be screened for. That's cystic fibrosis and spinal muscular atrophy. Cystic fibrosis has been recommended by both groups for many years, since the early 2000s. Spinal muscular atrophy has been recommended by ACMG for many years and was just added in 2017 by American College of OBGYN. And you can see also in terms of ethnic screening, they recommend that Ashkenazi Jewish patients be offered a panel of disorders. And there's a difference in the size of the panel from ACMG and ACOG, but both recommend identification of that group, and we'll talk more about that. ACOG also talks about hemoglobinopathy screening, and ACMG is really silent towards hemoglobinopathy screening. One of the issues with ethnic-based screening, which I think most of you are aware of, is ethnicity is not always clear. How do you determine ethnicity? Well, you ask the patient. And part of the problem is, first of all, the patient most of the time doesn't know truly what their ethnic background is. Also, the other thing is that in multi-ethnic societies like the United States and many other countries, the data from the United States is that 1 in 7 new marriages is between spouses of different ethnic backgrounds. So we end up having mixed ethnicity. And the second, on the right-hand side, 40% of Americans can't correctly identify the ethnicity of all 4 of their grandparents. And we'll give you some data about that in just a minute. The first conditions that, as I mentioned, that were recommended for pan-ethnic screening were cystic fibrosis and SMA. And this is from a recent committee opinion in 2017 from ACOG when SMA was added to the pan-ethnic recommendation. And they recommend that carrier screening for cystic fibrosis and spinal muscular atrophy should be offered to all women who are pregnant or considering pregnancy. And just my little plug for preconception. Preconception testing. It's not done very much, but that would, at least in my opinion, be the ideal time to really offer screening. So my little plug for that, and for everyone to at least keep that in mind. Why cystic fibrosis and SMA? That's been a question I've thought about many times. How did those get to be the 2 disorders that are on the panel? And thinking back, I think cystic fibrosis probably got added because it was one of the first genes identified. And I think that everyone was so excited at the time that you could do it that they said, oh, this is great. Let's screen everyone. And also, with the discovery of Delta 508 accounting for 75% of the mutations, I think everyone thought, oh, there'll be a couple of more mutations and we'll have 99% plus. And of course, none of that turned out to be true. But I think that's one of the reasons why cystic fibrosis got initially added as the earliest disorder to be screened for. Spinal muscular atrophy is less clear. It's the second most common life-threatening autosomal recessive condition. But it took a long time for that to be added, and I think that one of the reasons that did get added was because of the efforts of many advocacy groups to push for that, and I think finally that new guidelines. So I think that's a good example of the influence that advocacy groups can have in doing that. But we'll talk a little bit about carrier frequencies and things about cystic fibrosis and SMA compared to other disorders that we might be screening for. International screening landscape is kind of all over the map in terms of what's screened for. I've put up some of the countries that don't necessarily have guidelines but offer screening programs. Australia has offered screening for a long time. It's my understanding that, and afterwards someone may want to speak up, that Australia is embarking on a pilot program of over 1,000 genes for prenatal screening. So it's interesting, but most of the companies have most of the countries have hemoglobinopathies, Tay-Sachs disease or HA disorders, cystic fibrosis, and SMA, and many include Fragile X. Cyprus has also been another place where screening has been done for a long time. They have one of the highest incidences of carrier frequency of beta thalassemia, and that's been very successful there. United States, we've already gone over what the guidelines are there, but it really varies among the countries, and this is not comprehensive, but there certainly is an interest in carrier screening around the world. The thing I want to spend most of the time talking about is expanded carrier screening. Expanded carrier screening was a new concept in 2009, 2010, and the people from Council came to me while I was in practice, and the value proposition at the time was, we can screen for 100 disorders for the same price that your patient is paying for cystic fibrosis. Well, I thought, this is crazy, how can this startup do that? And it took a long time, but they finally convinced me that their technology was sound and convinced many other practices, and carrier screening, expanded carrier screening was instituted for many patients around this time. And Council published 2 publications. The first was in 2013, looking at the results from screening of about 23,000 pregnancies. And many people thought this was great. This was really the first data looking at what the expectations were following expanded carrier screening. But many people wanted to see a larger patient series, and so we published in 2016 in JAMA a series of almost 350,000 patients. And the main findings were that guideline-based screening, and what I'm referring to are US guidelines, ACOG and ACMG, which is mainly cystic fibrosis and SMA, missed a significant percentage of pregnancies that were potentially affected with a serious disorder. And it also differed among ethnicity. For example, in East Asians, 94% of pregnancies were missed by using a traditional approach. Hispanic population, 79%. Northern European, even, where cystic fibrosis carrier detection rates, sensitivities were pretty high, you still miss 65% of serious disorders, and Ashkenazi Jewish, about 55%. The other thing that's important to remember is that with expanded carrier screening, many of the disorders on these panels are fairly rare, but if you look at them in combination, the frequency of having an affected condition is about 1 in 300. So about the same as many of the other things that we actually do screening for now. People have talked about this, so I always put this slide in. People talk about the Wilson and Younger kind of criteria, and I think it's kind of an obligatory slide. You have to put it when you're talking about screening. But, I want to point out that this was developed or published first in 1968 before any screening really had been done. So some of the things are a little bit dated. And WHO updated the guidelines to try and be more current with technology back in 2008, but it's still, a lot has changed since 2008. And one bullet I just want to point out is the third one down on the right is there should be a defined target population. And I don't think that that's so clear anymore with the availability of testing and the cost of testing dropping over the years. So I think we have to rethink these guidelines, and I think that these were helpful when people were thinking of how to approach screening, but I think times have changed. What does ACOG say now about screening? They say that ethnic-specific, pan-ethnic, and expanded carrier screening are acceptable strategies for pre-pregnancy and prenatal carrier screening. So they're saying that all of these approaches are acceptable. So how do you pick what to do? And the first thing is, if you're going to do expanded carrier screening and increase the number of disorders that are potentially detectable, how do you decide on what disorders to put on the panel? And no one has an exact answer, but some of the things we think of in terms of deciding if a disorder should be on the panel is severity, when there's actionability, prevalence, and sensitivity. So I think it's important that you have a scheme, at least, for trying to sort through different disorders that you may want to screen for. What does ACOG say on this? And actually, they have talked about what should be on a panel, and there have been a couple of publications supporting their approach for what disorder should be there. And what they say is disorder selected for inclusion on expanded panels should meet several of the following consensus determined criteria. So it's a little unclear, hard to know what several means. So it'd be nice to see a little more specificity to that. The first thing, though, we're going to talk about a little bit more is have a carrier frequency of greater or equal to 1 in 100, well-defined phenotype, have a detrimental effect on quality of life, cause cognitive or physical impairment, requires surgical or medical intervention, prenatal diagnosis is available, or have an onset earlier in life. And I think you can see the continuity from the Wilson and Younger kind of ideas to this panel. I think there's a history of thinking about those, so I think that's good. But that 1 in 100, let's talk about that. The problem is that they don't define where the 1 in 100, what the 1 in 100 means. Is it in all ethnicities? Is it in any ethnicity? And what about X-linked conditions? It really doesn't talk about that at all. So what we did was look at, if you applied that 1 in 100 criteria, this is published in Genetics and Medicine, what would happen if you looked at 1 in 100 in all ethnicities? And at the red are the observed at-risk couples that would be missed by that criteria, requiring 1 in 100 in all ethnicities. And after all, that's what you're really looking for, are at-risk couples. You want to identify the highest percentage of at-risk couples. So 1 in 100 in all ethnicities misses 55%. What about 1 in 100 in any ethnicity? Well, that does much better. It actually only misses 11%. So that 1 in 100 number sounds pretty good. And a little aside, a number of us asked where that 1 in 100 came from. And I think Tony Gregg is in the audience, or is here. And Tony has told me that that's a number that he just made up at a meeting and kind of stopped, as many of these things do, and become something that is just passed down from paper to paper. But it actually turns out that it's a pretty good number. When you look at, so
The other issue is the ethnicity issue, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And a couple of questions come up. How closely does patients' self-reported ethnicity match their genetic ancestry? And how well are patients served by ethnicity-specific screening guidelines? And one of the examples that we looked at was in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, since, as we've talked about, that's been really a model for screening. And at the bottom, on the x-axis, you can see the Ashkenazi Jewish genetic ancestry versus the percent of self-reported ancestry. So, as it turns out, with the screening that we do, we can actually determine genetic ancestry by SNP evaluation. So, we've done that and looked back. And a couple of interesting things from this plot. If you look at one, which means that all of the grandparents are of Ashkenazi Jewish background, you can see a couple of things. First of all, that the percentage of people who self-report Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, very few of them actually have all four grandparents who are HA. So that's interesting. And I think that reflects, again, the intermarriage and multi-ethnicity that's happening in the population. You can see that the highest percentage by far is 3/4, or 3 out of 4 of the grandparents actually report that. And 1/2, or 2 out of 4 report that, is about 20%. The other thing that is important to look at, you can see those other bars, not just that light green color, whatever that's called. I always don't know the right name for it. But anyway, you can see that the other self-reported ethnicities for other mixed Caucasian, European, or Middle Eastern are fairly substantial in the 3/4 and the half ancestry. So these are couples that, women who don't report any HA ancestry, but yet have a significant amount of genetic ancestry. So they're being missed when you just do ethnic-based screening for HA disorders. Another thing is the concordance of self-reported ethnicities and genetic ancestry across ethnicities. And on the x-axis, you can see the genetic ancestry, and on the y-axis is self-reported ancestry. If there was full concordance, you'd see on the diagonal line that they'd all be 100%, that what they reported was actually what they are. You can see that that is not true. We don't have time to go into all the details, but for example, if you look at the Hispanic, people who report Hispanic ancestry, about 67% are European and 22% are Native American. So there's a mix, and people really don't know that. They think of themselves as one ancestry, if they know at all. But the truth is that many of these are mixed. So again, pointing out the problem with using ethnic-based screening. The other thing is that screening based on self-reported ethnicity misses an elevated risk in patients with intermediate genetic ancestry. And this is an example from the African American genetic ancestry. And you can see in the yellow color and in the light blue color that these are women who report no self-reported African history, yet they have medium and high, and medium being over between 25% and 50%, and high being over 50%, actual genetic ancestry. So you can see on the right that they have elevated chances of having being a carrier for several disorders, and we could make the list larger. But again, these would be missed because people are not reporting this ancestry, yet they have a percentage of it. And again, another, I think, strong piece of evidence for pan-ethnic screening. Okay, this one, I really like this, and it looks really confusing, but really the important thing is to look at the orange and the blue boxes. And the orange boxes are the conditions now that are recommended for guideline screening. And across the x-axis on the bottom are the different ethnic groups, and on the right are the disorders. And the blue boxes are disorders that are more frequent than the least frequent condition now recommended for screening. So if you use frequencies just based on cystic fibrosis, SMA, and the other HA disorders, if you want to have equity in terms of carrier frequency among all the other disorders, then all the boxes in blue should be included too, because they have carrier frequencies which are just as frequent as the other disorders. So this is just the top of the list, but look at all the blue ones that would have to be included just to provide equity in terms of screening. Okay, so what do we do with all this? Couple of things. First of all, ethnicity-specific guidelines result in inequities in care. We've talked about that from the earlier slides, but I think this is a nice, simple look at the proportion of affected pregnancies that are detected following ethnicity-based guidelines. And you can see African American is pretty high because sickle cell is a big percentage of that. Northern European is relatively low, Hispanic is very low, East Asian is low. We could look at this for all of the ethnic groups. One simple change to the ACOG criteria, though, of saying in at least one ethnicity, and I showed you that on that earlier slide, how that would affect picking up carriers. And look at how it changes the affected pregnancies that would be detected by that change. And that one on the right is actually 95%. It kind of dropped off the slide. So a panel of using the ACOG criteria resulted in about 40 conditions, and we looked at this, and Tony Gregg and Mike Go also published this recently in Genetics and Medicine. So what we feel is that expanded carrier screening detects more at-risk couples. I hope I've convinced you of that. Pan-ethnic screening is more effective and reduces inequities, and hopefully the data I presented convinced you of that. And what I think is we should have a new basic panel based on the ACOG criteria of 1 in 100 other qualifications to replace CF and SMA and the ethnic-based screening, and that would increase the detection rate significantly. I'd like to acknowledge my development team who helped put this together. I'm sure it is in the audience here. And also to thank all the former employees of Council who had a vision and carried it through, so thank you.
Thank you, Jim, very much. I think we've got time for one or two quick questions. If anybody has a question, there's microphones at the side. One thing I wanted to ask you was, if you're producing a panel that has a very broad reach in terms of genetic syndromes, do you think that really complicates the counselling that you have to give women, or do you simply just say, look, these conditions are severe, life-threatening, and then you counsel them when something pops up?
Yeah, exactly, Anna. That would be my advice, and actually, Sherman Elias and George Annas published that many years ago in the New England Journal, just thinking ahead that this type of testing was going to be available. So yeah, I think that's exactly right, to reassure couples that most of these are some recessive, so both have to be carriers, and then have someone with the expertise to do that. So exactly.
I think we'll move on. Thank you very much.
So it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker in this session, Rosa Chu. She's the Cho Ming Lee Professor of Chemical Pathology and Assistant Dean of Research at the Faculty of Medicine in the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She has many other roles, has published a large amount of papers, and is a true expert and leader in cell-free DNA analysis. And welcome, Dr. Chu.
Thank you, Inya, and thank you, Anna. So for this session, can you hear me well enough if I speak like that? Up the back? Okay, good. So in this session, I have been asked to talk about our group's latest research work. And as you soon see, because this is still early days in this area of research, towards the end of the talk, we have to daydream a little bit about the future possibilities of this work. First, here are my disclosures. We're here to talk about cell-free DNA analysis. That is, to take a mother's blood sample and focus on the analysis of the plasma and the serum portion, meaning that there are no cells, and then analyzing the DNA that are floating around, free floating, not associated with cells within that sample. And to date, numerous applications have been reported for the use of this material. And some of them have already been applied to routine use. For example, the non-invasive prenatal screening of the common aneuploidies, such as Down syndrome, is now available in many parts of the world. And yesterday, we also heard about some centers offering what we call all-chromosome NIPT, that is, the cell-free DNA analysis also covers the aneuploidies of chromosomes beyond those of the common ones, that is, namely 13, 18, and 21. And if one practices all-chromosome NIPT, one may run the chance of detecting rare autosomal trisomies. And we heard a wonderful debate yesterday about the potential merits as well as the potential harm of doing this. I'm not going to focus on this discussion today, but instead I'd like to focus on this maybe worrying piece of information. That is, with the widespread use of non-invasive cell-free DNA testing, we start to witness a major decline in the number of invasive procedures that are being performed. Well, you may say that, well, why am I commenting on this? Isn't that the main goal of introducing non-invasive screening? That is to reduce the number of women needing invasive testing unnecessarily. Yes, that's true. But on the other hand, now we're detecting more and more of the different conditions, for example, the rare autosomal trisomies. And as you heard from yesterday's debate, the cytogenetic expertise that will be needed to work out and decipher what is really going on with the pregnancy beyond the common trisomies is actually very sophisticated. So in our group, we were thinking about, well, how can we solve this problem? That is, with the decline in the number of invasive procedures being performed, and yet with the need to increase the sophistication of these cytogenetic techniques, can we do something about this? So we had this crazy idea. We thought, well, we moved away, a little bit away from cell-based analysis. Cell-based, I don't mean the non-invasive cell-based analysis. I meant from an invasive sample to analyzing fragments of cell-free DNA in a non-invasive sample. And I wonder, can we push the technology a bit further? That is, can we use the cell-free fragmented DNA and piece back together the original cytogenetic architecture of the cell? So this is what I try to talk about today, and let's daydream a bit about this. Well, this area of work for our group, we started embarking on this pretty much related to this case. That is, this was a sample sent at 11 weeks just for routine non-invasive cell-free DNA testing for trisomy screening. And we detected a huge amount of chromosome 21 DNA in this particular sample. And it was so big, the amount, that we thought it cannot be from the baby. It must be coming from the mother. So when we opened up the data and then looked, we found out that in this particular case, besides chromosome 21, there were chromosome 1 and chromosome 17 also had abnormally high amounts. So, of course, with this day and age, we would realize that there must be something fishy going on. And indeed, it turned out to be a case where the mother had a follicular lymphoma. And we obtained a biopsy from the problematic lymph node, and you can see that the sequencing results of that lymph node was completely identical to what we saw in maternal plasma. And then this woman terminated her pregnancy and then went on to chemotherapy, and then after treatment, you can see that the maternal plasma returned back to normal. There were no longer abnormalities. So with the increasing chance to see or count maternal malignancy through non-invasive renal screening, we started to think, well, can we analyze the cell-free DNA in the sample and then work back out which organ actually contributed those DNA decided to develop a branch of tests called plasma DNA tissue mapping. This means using plasma DNA, cell-free DNA, to then map the tissue or organs that are contributing DNA into the sample. And this is actually earlier work which I presented at previous ISPD meetings. This particular work makes use of the DNA methylation profile because we know that different organs, different tissues, they have different expression profiles, so they have different DNA methylation signatures. So we then did mathematics to compare the DNA methylation signatures between different organs and tissues, and we looked for markers that were more specific for liver, markers that were more specific for placenta, etc. And then when we analyze a maternal plasma sample from a pregnant woman, we need to do bisulfite sequencing to analyze the DNA methylation signature amongst the cell-free DNA. And then amongst those DNA molecules, we try to look for the liver marker, the placenta marker, etc. And then with calculation, we can work out what portion of DNA came from which organ. And for example, if we analyze plasma collected from the first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, each vertical bar represents a sample from one pregnant woman, you will see that the majority of DNA floating around in yours and my plasma, they're actually from the neutrophils. And less than 20% comes from the lymphocytes, the B and the T. And a single-digit amount came from the liver, and then the rest, in a pregnant woman, of course, came from the placenta. That is what we call the cell-free fetal DNA. So then we apply this technology onto the case where the woman actually had follicular lymphoma, and then when we analyze it, you can see that, well, the B lymphocyte proportion is no longer less than 20%, it turned out to be 60%. So this work tells us that amongst the masses of many molecules of cell-free DNA floating around in the plasma sample, actually we can recategorize them back to their original organ of origin. Then this work led us to think, can we be more ambitious? Instead of working out the DNA methylation profile, can we actually piece back together the original cytogenetic architecture of where the cell that contributed that pool of cell-free DNA? And so we looked at what we call and it's highly fragmented, the DNA. Well, how fragmented it is? Well, we sequenced many molecules from a maternal plasma sample and then worked out the size distribution plot. So you can see on the x-axis here is actually the size of each DNA molecule, and you can see that most of the cell-free DNA molecules in the sample is actually less than 200 bases, so they're really short. And then we separated the DNA that belonged to the fetus from the DNA that belonged to the mother, and then the size of the mother's DNA is shown in the red curve, and you can see that it has the highest peak at about 166 base pair, and the blue curve is actually the size of the DNA of the baby, which they turn out to be slightly shorter, and it's about 142 base pairs as the peak. And for those who have done biology, these numbers actually would ring a bell, because actually when the DNA is packed into each cell, they're wound around histones, the nucleosomes, and for the double helix we wound exactly around one nucleosome is about 142 bases. And then between the two nucleosomes, there's a linker, piece of linker, and if you add that linker, usually it's about 20 bases, and that's about 166 in total. So that tells you that actually, when cell-free DNA fragments, the cut is between nucleosomes. But for the mother is with the linker, and for the baby's DNA, the linker is chopped off, right? So that's interesting. But when we looked at this graph, a major realization came to our minds. If the baby's DNA is usually shorter than the mother's DNA, and if you put every piece back to the original genome, it means that the baby's DNA cutting site, the ending site, must be different, usually, from that of the mother. They fragment at different locations. So then we set out to work out whether this is true. Do the ending sites of fetal and maternal DNA differ? And in order to do this, we had to sequence one particular maternal plasma sample up to more than 200-fold coverage of the human genome. Well, what does this mean? It means that it's like doing a cell-free DNA test for trisomy 21 screening, but we are doing it 1,000 times on this particular sample, 1,000 times, and then adding all the data together. And it means that we have a lot of data from this particular sample, and when we align each molecule, let's say to chromosome 21, you can see that all the molecules stack up. So this is what this plot is trying to show you. Each red line represents the start and the end of a piece of DNA molecule that came from the bottom. And you can see that we have about 200 molecules stacked up. What is interesting, and on the bottom, let's say they are chromosome 21 coordinates. What is interesting is that you can see there are particular locations where a lot of molecules ended at. This is completely different from when we obtain, let's say, genomic DNA from the mother's blood cells, and we artificially fragment the genomic DNA in the laboratory. And when we did that, the ending sites are completely random. All right, so there are no particular genomic coordinates that have a high frequency as random. But when we look at endogenous cell-free DNA molecules that are floating around in the plasma of the pregnant woman, you can see that it likes to end here. There's a particular high frequency here. And more interestingly, if we add on the blue molecules, that is the fetal DNA molecules, they're usually shorter than the mother's DNA, you can see here, there are different ending sites that emerge. They end at a slightly different location. And if what we're doing is not an artifact, we should be able to count the number of DNA molecules that end at the fetal preferred ending sites, and then express that as a ratio to the number of molecules that ended at the preferred ending sites for the mother's DNA. And if we work out this ratio, that is fetal to mother, we should get a correlation with the fetal fraction. And we did. But this is not your usual fetal fraction. This data to us was amazing. Let me explain to you why it is so. Remember, I've only done the crazy 1,000 times DNA sequencing on one maternal plasma sample, and then we looked for the ends that were specific to that baby and the ends that were specific to that mother. But then, when we count the molecules that ended at those sites, they were not private to that pregnancy. We would find them in another 26 pregnancies that were completely unrelated. And for this, when we generated this plot, these 26 pregnancies, we didn't spend time to sequence them deeply. These were just data that we obtained from our routine trisomy 21 non-invasive screening test. So it means that there were enough fetus versus mother specific ending sites scattered around the genome that when we just picked up a small amount of them, we can get a fetal DNA fraction correlation. So it means that this is biologically reproducible. And when we look at, let's say, the data that I've just shown you is scattered across the whole genome. But now, when we look at data that are only on chromosome 21, and when we look, and instead of analyzing every single DNA molecule that came from chromosome 21, we only focus on molecules came from chromosome 21 and ended at the fetal preferred ending sites. You can see that in trisomy 21 pregnancies, indeed, there were higher numbers of these fetal preferred ending sites compared with that of the pregnancies not affected by trisomy 21. So this shows that the baby having a third copy of chromosome 21 and the DNA molecules still ended at those preferred sites, and there were more of them. And what is interesting is that this phenomenon doesn't only apply to the placenta versus the mother's blood cells. It exists for other organs. So we did similar analysis by obtaining plasma samples from patients who have received liver transplantation. These are not pregnant women, okay? These are liver transplant recipients. So we tried to analyze the DNA that came from the donor's liver versus the non-liver DNA, which is the DNA that came from the original cells of the recipient. And again, we sequenced this sample to about 200-fold coverage. That is 1,000 times of a typical NIPT test. And then with all the many cell-free DNA molecules that we have sequenced, again, we align them up to the genome, along the genome. And because we have so many molecules, we can stack them up. And then after we stack them up, we look for locations in the genome that were preferred by the donor DNA, namely meaning that the molecules that have the SNP allele that came And again, when we did this, we found that across the genome, so this is genome coordinates on chromosome 4, there were locations where both the donor and the recipient DNA particularly like to end at. The peak is the ending frequency. Alright, so the higher, the more likely the DNA will end there. And there are sites that are particularly favored by the donor versus that of the recipient. And when we express them as a ratio, just like the fetal fraction, we can work out the liver DNA fraction in these examples. So this also shows that liver, DNA came from the liver, they also will be fragmented, but they have their preferred fragment sites. So I've just reported to you the logical observation. The next question is, why is the fragmentation so reproducible? Why is it the same between you and I? Well, our hypothesis is related to the DNA packing. So remember, when we look at the shortness of the DNA, the sizes reminded us of the nucleosome packing. So our hypothesis is that there are enzymes that cut the nice genomic DNA into the fragmented cell-free DNA. And when there are nucleosomes occupying the DNA, it is not susceptible to cutting. But when the chromatin is free, we call it open chromatin domain, they are very susceptible to cutting. So this is what you end up seeing. And then because of this occupancy by the protein, then the ends of each plasmid DNA molecules, they actually leave the signature to tell us what was the original DNA packing. So in order to prove this, we actually looked at our actual data. So there is a region on chromosome 12 where the location of where the nucleosomes are well known in the field. All right, this is publicly known. And then what we did was we took the plasma cell-free DNA data that we have obtained from the cases that we have sequenced very deeply, and then we stacked them up. So we just align them along the chromosome 12 region. And then what you see is these are actually the number of DNA molecules that we can see along this region. What you can see is that whenever there's a nucleosome location, there are many plasma DNA molecules. But in between the nucleosomes, there are far fewer plasma DNA molecules. So this supports our hypothesis. There's in between the nucleosomes, the DNA just gets chopped up. And when we align the ends of the short DNA molecules versus the ends of the long DNA molecules, we saw what we predicted. That is, they ended at different sites on this location map. And so the next thing we need to answer is why the fetal DNA or the placental DNA ended at those sites versus the mother's placenta DNA ended at other sites. So in other words, we're asking why DNA from different organs are cut differently. And we have to think about the chromatin accessibility. So it is known in biology that when certain genes are expressed, the DNA is loosely bound around the nucleosomes, and we call those open chromatin domains, or the euchromatin regions. And when there are gene locations where they are not expressed, then the DNA becomes very tightly packed around the nucleosomes, and we call those pactual chromatin. And in fact, there are enzymes that are available for researchers to use for transposase. They like to cut the open chromatin domain. Right? So we can apply this technology, cutting the DNA, and then sequence them, and then identify which locations in the genome are actually open chromatin domain and which locations are closed chromatin domain. So what we did was, this time it's not cell-free DNA, it's not plasma sample. We obtained genomic DNA from blood cells, mother's blood cell, and applied ATAC-C. All right? And after we cut the blood cells, we saw 3 peaks. And you can see that here are the very short DNA. And we believe that those came from the open chromatin domain. And then the second peak is actually coming from DNA that is cut around 1 nucleosome unit. And then this longer DNA is a DNA that came from the locations that were cut between 2 nucleosome units. So this is a maternal blood cell. How about placental DNA? When we applied ATAC-C, we only saw short DNA. This meant that the placenta is an organ that is highly transcriptionally active, and so it has very loose chromatin, and so it can be subjected to cutting. And this actually explains why fetal DNA or placental DNA is shorter than the maternal DNA. Or, more simply put, different organs have different gene expression profile, so they have different chromatin packing profile. And the different chromatin packing profile resulted in the different size profiles of plasma DNA that came from those organs, and so it left behind different ending signatures. And we also found that this is not limited to just nucleosome packing. Any proteins that occupy DNA would affect the DNA ending sites. And so, for example, for DNA that is being transcribed, at the transcription start site is occupied by DNA polymerase, and when the transcription start site is occupied by DNA polymerase, there are fewer ending sites, so the plasma DNA is preserved. So, Inya, I'm mindful of the time, don't worry, so I'll skip a few slides. So then we have extended this work to identify different open chromatin domains in different tissue types, and then we predicted that the plasma DNA coming from those organs should have ending sites around those tissue-specific open chromatin domain. And so that will allow us to identify pools of ending sites that can be separated to the different organs. So this is actually plasma DNA analysis of non-pregnant individuals. You can see that we can categorize DNA molecules with ending sites coming from different organs. And if we analyze pregnant samples, you can see that there were increased DNA molecules for the placenta ending sites. And when we analyze hepatocellular carcinoma patients, there were increased ending sites of plasma DNA coming from the liver. When we analyze samples from colorectal cancer patients, amongst the plasma DNA, there were molecules with ending sites belonging to the intestinal group. And when we analyzed lung cancer patients, there were increased DNA molecules with the ending sites belonging to the lungs. And in the interest of time, I'll skip a few of these slides. So, what I've shown you is that we have done work to show that amongst the DNA molecules that are floating around in your sample, using the end signature, we can subcategorize them into different orbits and piece together the original chromatin architecture of DNA from those orbits. Nowadays, we know that the DNA content within each cell is actually organized in a 3D manner, and there are proteins that hold the chromosomes together. So I'm just daydreaming that hopefully in the future, we will be able to not just piece together the chromatin architecture of different cells, but the chromatin architecture between different chromosomes within each cell. So to end, cell-free DNA analysis is a tool. Besides just counting the DNA molecules in the sample, we can now work out the chromatin architecture by looking at the coverage of the DNA molecules across the genome, their ending sites, and maybe the ending signatures. Actually, we're doing a lot of work here. So in the lab right now, we have actually generated a lot more data that is yet to be published. So fragmentomics, stay tuned. And I have to thank my collaborators and the team members that generated this work, and actually many team members are in the audience. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one or two quick questions.
Yes, so the apoptosis, we've even worked out, right now in our lab, we're working on which enzyme is responsible for the cutting, and indeed, it starts with the apoptosis. But the enzyme that cuts the DNA into the apoptotic ladder, the location of the cutting is affected by where the open chromatin domains are. So your comment is definitely valid, and it's all interrelated.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms.
So our next speaker is Valerie Cantor from Natera Children's Hospital Philadelphia, presenting on behalf of her colleagues. And she's going to talk about validation of SNP-based, non-invasive prenatal screening test to detect maternal X chromosome abnormalities. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? So, hi everyone, my name is Val. I am a genetic counselor at Natera, and today I'm going to be talking about validation of a SNP-based, non-invasive prenatal screening test's ability to detect maternal X chromosome abnormalities. As mentioned, I am a full-time employee at Natera and an equity holder there. To get started, we utilize a SNP-based, non-invasive prenatal screening, which gives us the ability to differentiate between maternal and fetal cell-free DNA patterns. We are validated to report out on fetal trisomy 21, 18, 13, monosomy X, triploidy, and select microdeletions. Now, I think as everybody in this room knows, if you do a quick literature search, and what has been a big topic of the meeting so far, is we've learned that maternal chromosome abnormalities can impact NIPT and NIPT results. It can either lead to non-reportable results or false positives. With our platform, being that we are a SNP-based platform, we can detect when the maternal abnormality is in the maternal cell-free DNA pattern versus fetal. But how we handle this reporting is we release what we refer to as an uninformative DNA pattern result. Now, I should mention that there are a few different causes, which we'll get into, for uninformative DNA pattern results, and maternal chromosome abnormalities are just one of them. And uninformative DNA pattern results for our laboratory do make up about 0.9% of all of our cases. And these can be either a full uninformative DNA pattern where we don't release any results on any of the chromosomes, or this could be an uninformative DNA pattern on the X chromosome only. In this scenario, we will release results for 21, 18, and 13. So as mentioned, maternal chromosome abnormalities are just one of the possible causes for an uninformative DNA pattern. Another scenario is it could just be normal variation. There could be something in that SNP profile that is throwing off our algorithm's ability to make a call, and that would lead to this type of a result. I'd say the most common scenario, though, is in this middle box right here, where we have either a maternal or fetal mosaicism. And we are not validated to report out on any type of mosaicism, so if a mosaic line is detected, as it stands right now, we release this uninformative result. Another possibility would be a maternal or fetal copy number variation. So this really refers to a deletion or duplication across one of our target chromosomes, be that 21, 18, 13, X or Y, because those are chromosomes that are not part of our validated microdeletion panel. And as our current recommendations stand, for any type of uninformative DNA pattern result, we recommend genetic counseling with detailed ultrasound evaluation and the possibility of prenatal diagnostic testing. In all of these scenarios, we would not recommend a redraw from either our NIPT or any other platform. Reason being is because we're picking up on something inherent in this DNA pattern that we're not able to understand. So we don't think that a redraw would lead to any additional information. I would like to call attention to that maternal or fetal mosaicism box and the maternal or fetal copy number variation. Again, as it stands now, we group those together. But because we are a SNP-based platform, as I've mentioned earlier, we do have the ability to pick up if that abnormality that we are detecting is in the maternal line of DNA or the fetal line of DNA. But we've never been able to report this before because we haven't been validated to do so, which led to our objective of this paper. So we wanted to prospectively validate a SNP-based NIPS's ability to report out on maternal chromosome X copy number variations. And for the purpose of this talk, copy number variations refer to mosaicism as well. So the study was designed to include all domestic singleton non-egg donor cases that received any form of an uninformative result, whether full or X only, that were accessioned in our laboratory between May 2018 and December 2018. Cases were entered twice weekly into a database that was accessible by study personnel. And then the maternal Buffy codes for these samples were sent to the Center for Applied Genomics at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who is our partner for this study. And the maternal Buffy codes were then run on a chromosomal SNP-based global screening array. And for the purposes of this paper and for this study, the results from that global screening array were defined as truth. So we had a total of 194,385 samples accessioned in our laboratory during the study time period, and any case that received any form of that uninformative DNA pattern result were considered eligible. And these cases were then subdivided into two different groups. Group A, which referred to the suspected maternal X abnormality group, and there was a total of 149 cases put into that category. And Group B, which is when we suspected that the uninformative DNA pattern was due to either a fetal or placental abnormality, whether that be mosaicism or a copy number variation. And there was a total of 613 cases in this group. And I think that part of the reason why we saw so many cases in this fetal discrepancy, or this fetal abnormality group, was because this group included 21, 18, 13, X or Y. Any chromosome that we suspected there was a fetal condition was accessioned to this group, versus Group A was only when there was a maternal X abnormality suspected. From there, we had 42 cases that were ineligible or discarded from Group A and 111 that were ineligible or discarded from Group B. And this really refers to cases that might have been discarded in our laboratory before our study team had the opportunity to ship them over to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, or they were ineligible if they were samples accessioned from the states of New York or Oregon, because those states are opt-in for research states, not opt-out. Which left us with a total study group for Group A of 107 samples where there was a suspected maternal X abnormality, and 107 samples in Group B where there was a suspected fetal abnormality. The 395 cases that were not included for Group B was just from a power perspective and a budget perspective. So we had powered this study to have 107 samples in each group. So once we reached that threshold, we had to stop collecting samples in that Group B. So once these samples were pulled, they were de-identified and blinded and given a unique study ID. So the Center for Applied Genomics had no idea what our NIPS interpretation was for each of these samples, and they were sent over to have the Buffy group run. And from a reporting standpoint, we defined that anything that was identified on the global screening array that had a copy number variation greater than or equal to 5 megabases in size, or a mosaicism threshold greater than or equal to 20% was deemed reportable for our purposes. From a results standpoint, this just shows some of the demographic information. So we looked at the median across maternal age, gestational age, and fetal fraction amongst our study group, which would be our Group A, where there was a suspected maternal X abnormality, and our Group B, which is when there was a suspected fetal abnormality, and we did not find any statistical difference between the two groups. And this is actually what we were hoping for. We did not want to see a higher percentage of women who were over the age of 35 in one group over the other, or we didn't want to see a higher percentage of fetal fraction in one group over the other. So we wanted to make sure each cohort mirrored each other. This slide really goes over the main crux of the study. So our whole objective here was to validate our ability of being a SNP-based NIPS platform to correctly identify maternal X chromosomal abnormalities. And this is basically showing how we were able, how the performance data behind this paper. So we looked at a total of 107 cases, like I mentioned, and of the 107, 101 actually did have a confirmed chromosome X abnormality from the global screening array run on mom's Buffy code. 3 samples were discordant where the maternal Buffy code was normal, and 3 samples there was something seen in the global screening array, but it did not meet threshold for reporting. So this would be an example of there was mosaicism possibly seen, but it didn't meet that 20% threshold that was required for us to consider it a true positive from the global screening array. So for the purposes of our study, these were classified as discordant results, which gave us an overall positive predictive value of 94.4%, or 101 out of the 107 cases were confirmed to have that maternal X chromosome abnormality. And just to put it into perspective, our study group was beyond excited when we saw these results because we had powered the study to reach a minimum positive predictive value of 25%. So that was kind of where the bar was at 25%. So when we got a 94.4% positive predictive value, it exceeded our expectations. Group B, which is that suspected fetal abnormality group, was used as more of a control sampling. So for this purpose, we thought that there was an uninformative DNA pattern result that we were releasing due to something seen in that fetal or placental DNA line. So when we ran mom's Buffy code then, we did not want to find any maternal abnormalities in that Buffy code. And sure enough, of the 107 samples that we suspected there was a fetal abnormality, in all 107, mom's Buffy code was normal from the global screening array results. So this gives us a negative predictive value of 100%. We thought it would be interesting to further break down that group of 197 where there was a suspected maternal X abnormality to look into what did we think was going on with mom for each of these cases. And in over half, so in 59 of those cases, we suspected from our NIPS platform that mom had either a 45X, 46XX mosaicism. Of those results, there were 2 that were discordant in that group, And all three, where there was a suspected finding on the global screening array, but threshold wasn't met, fell into this 45X, 46XX group as well, which to me makes sense because the global screening array did come back that they thought that there was really low level of mosaicism, they just couldn't report it out. So it makes sense that from our SNP-based platform, we had suspected that there was mosaicism as well. The only other discordant result was in that maternal X abnormality unspecified group, and that really refers to complex X rearrangements, so large deletions across the X chromosome, etc. We thought it would be interesting to further break down that 101 cases where there was concordancy between our SNP-based and IPS classification of a maternal X finding and the global screening array. Because for all 101 of these cases, there was clearly a maternal X finding present. So then we wanted to take it a step further and say, how often did our interpretation from our SNP-based and IPS platform perfectly match the interpretation we received back from the global screening array, which again, for the purposes of our study, was used as truth. And in 66.3% of cases, our interpretations matched perfectly. What this would refer to is, for example, if we thought that there was mosaicism for 45X, 46XX, the global screening array came back confirming that there was mosaicism for 45X, 46XX. In 33.7% of samples, there was an X abnormality identified in both groups, the SNP-based NIPS and the global screening array, but our interpretations might have differed slightly. For example, we might have thought with our NIPS platform that there was 45X, 46XX mosaicism, and the global screening array came back reporting that there was mosaicism, but they were unable to classify that mosaicism as either XO or trisomy X. So for the purposes of our interpretations, we consider them a slightly discordant interpretation because the global screening array couldn't confirm if it was 45X or 47XXX mosaic. Another example of a difference in interpretation would be if our SNP-based and IPS platform suspected mosaicism for trisomy X and the global screening array came back that there was trisomy X, but in a non-mosaic form. So again, in all of these cases, there was a true X abnormality identified, the interpretations just differ slightly. Which brings me to one of the limitations of this paper, is the source of maternal cell-free DNA used for mom was plasma, and the source used for truth was maternal buffy. So the two tissue sources were different, which is likely why there was some difference in the degree of mosaicism that was detected in our NIPS platform versus the global screening array. Another limitation is that we did not have any follow-up for the fetal group where there was suspected fetal or placental findings. Now, if we go back to the objective of this paper, it was to validate our ability to pick up a maternal X chromosome abnormality with our NIPS. It was not to obtain fetal outcome, but that is planned as our next step. So we do want to follow up on all suspected fetal and unspecified uninformative DNA pattern results to obtain pregnancy outcome. In conclusion, of the suspected maternal X abnormality cases, 94.4% were confirmed by the global screening array, and all maternal Buffy code analyses in that suspected fetal group were considered normal for an NPV of 100%. Therefore, the high PPV and high NPV observed in our study group, we feel validates our ability to detect suspected maternal X abnormalities with our NIPS, and due to this validation, we feel that we are able to report these. And we hope that this can help guide clinical pregnancy management. To end, I would just like to thank my fellow contributors in our study group, including Dr. Kimberly Martin, who is the head of the study, other genetic counselors and statisticians at Natera, and our partners at CHOP.
Thank you very much, Bella. Fascinating. I think in the interest of time, we'll move on, but if you're interested, you'll be at the collaboration corner to take questions.
Yeah, and we have a booth over at the exhibitor area too.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So our next talk is exome sequencing for unidentifiable fetal syndromes, the impact of deep phenotyping by Shagun Agarwal and colleagues.
So good morning everyone. I'm going to present the findings of our work involving exome sequencing for unidentifiable fetal phenotypes with an emphasis on the impact of deep phenotyping on the test performance, both in terms of the diagnostic yield as well as the ability to identify novel genotype-phenotype association. So if you look at the literature reports along similar lines, these are very heterogeneous in terms of the inclusion criteria, the number of samples, And also, there is wide variability of the diagnostic yield from 8 to 60%, which is reported. And most studies report that yes, there are major limitations in terms of the phenotype ascertainment prenatally, as well as the information available in literature regarding the fetal phenotypes. So this particular study was actually carried out over a period of 5 years, with the primary aim to find out the performance of exome sequencing in unidentified or non-specific fetal phenotypes after excluding cytogenetic abnormalities and obvious monogenic disorders. And the secondary aim of this work was to try and find out novel genotype-phenotype associations and to look at the impact of the prenatal versus postnatal phenotype on the test performance. So the cases recruited were basically fetuses which were coming in for autopsy, so the total number being 204. All these cases underwent a very deep phenotyping, which involved clinical dysmorphology assessment, internal dissection, histopathology, radiology, and also a 3-generation pedigree evaluation. And following which we were able to exclude cases with miscellaneous or acquired etiologies, and subsequently we did cytogenetic testing and targeted molecular testing and excluded cases which had cytogenic abnormality or some monogenic disorders. So finally, wherever parental samples were available, so overall 32 cases, we went ahead and did a solo exome sequencing. The variant prioritization was done using standard pipelines and also by reviewing the literature and databases. And following this, we were able to, and of course, we also did a reassessment of phenotype in certain cases, sometimes even doing additional histopathological studies. So finally, we were able to identify pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant in 18 cases, variants of uncertain significance in 4, and in 10 cases, no positive variant was found. So in the 18 cases where we had a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant, majority of this, that is 16 cases, were actually having biallelic variants, of which, barring one case, all cases had homozygous variant, which basically reflects our population structure of inbreeding and consanguinity. And we were able to find novel phenotype associations in 3 cases, able to expand the known Mendelian disorder phenotype for prenatal, the prenatal expansion of the phenotype for 5 conditions, and in 2 cases we were able to find a dual Mendelian disorder. So the 3 cases where we had novel genotype-phenotype association, so this was one case of a 35-week-old IUD where the baby had internal hemorrhages, skin and joint abnormality, and also presence of these blebs on the lung surface, and this baby was actually found to have homozygous LOX variants. So heterozygous LOX variants are known to cause aortic aneurysms, whereas this is the first report of homozygous LOX variant in humans. And the findings of this case, both the gross as well as the histopathology findings, are actually quite similar to the mouse model of the LOX homozygous variants. Another baby whereby there was pericardial effusion and presence of these blebs on the visceral surfaces. This baby was found to have homozygous nonsense variants in the SERPINA11 gene, SERPINA11 belonging to the antitrypsin family of proteins, and one of the common gene which is there, which we are familiar with, is SERPINA1, which causes alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, whereby the lung findings are quite similar to what we found in this case. And then there was this baby, which was again an IUD with multiple malformation, where we found a heterozygous nonsense variant in the CDK8 gene, and recently missense variants in this particular gene have been reported to cause a pediatric developmental disorder, and diaphragmatic hernia was a novel finding in this case. In the 5 cases where we were able to expand the phenotype of a known Mendelian disorder, one baby was a case of Nijmegen-Reckitt syndrome, where the fetus presented with renal hypoplasia and corpus callosum agenesis, both these findings being quite rare in pediatric cohorts. Another baby who had multiple joint contractures, mainly distal, with some loose skin folds, cerebellar and genitourinary abnormality, was found to be a case of congenital disorder of glycosylation type 1D, with cutis laxa being a novel feature not reported in this subtype of CDG before. A fetus with a skeletal dysplasia phenotype and renal and cardiac abnormality was found to have homozygous variant in FGFR3 gene. So biallelic FGFR3 variants are actually very rare, and here the combination of these variants with renal and cardiac abnormality is quite an unusual finding. Another case was of Vicky syndrome, which is a very rare type of syndromic corpus callosum agenesis. Here we were able to demonstrate focal cortical dysgenesis on histopathology, and this again has not been reported before. And we were the fetus with Zellweger syndrome, which had facial dysmorphism, which is again not been reported in the fetal life. Two babies had dual Mendelian disorder. One fetus with arthrogryposis multiplex was actually having double heterozygote variants in FBN1, FBN2, so presenting with a blended phenotype of Marfan's and Beal syndrome. And another fetus had additive phenotype of Beckel-Gruber and Leber-Stoltenberg amaurosis. The other positive cases comprised of two cases of dystrophycopathy and one case with red-associated Hirschsprung disease, another of giant arterial calcification of infancy, a case with osteogenesis imperfecta type 7, another with DBARC syndrome, a baby with R1 related myopathy, and another with ACE-associated renal tubular dysgenesis. So overall, we saw that each of the component of the phenotype ascertainment, that is the ultrasound finding, the dysmorphology, the histology, the radiology, everything contributed significantly towards the variant prioritization, with dysmorphology playing a significant role in at least 10 cases. And in 2 cases, we had to perform a reverse phenotype to reach the final diagnosis. So variants of uncertain significance were found in 4 cases, and in 10 cases, we were not able to find any positive variant responsible for the phenotype. So following this, we tried to do an objective assessment of the impact of the depth of phenotyping on the variant prioritization. So for this purpose, all the cases where we had shortlisted a variant, either pathogenic, likely pathogenic, or variant of uncertain significance, we went ahead and retrospectively assessed the ultrasound findings. And then we used the Phenolyzer software, and we tried to see whether the variant which we had shortlisted could be prioritized by the by Phenolyzer in the top 50 gene lists, using only the ultrasound findings, or when we had the autopsy findings also available, and we tried to compare which is better or what is the impact of the additional autopsy findings. So here, for example, in the case where we had red-associated Hirschsprung disease, if we have only the ultrasound findings, the gene doesn't show up in the top 50 gene list, whereas when we put the autopsy findings, we get red as the third hit. And in contrast, in the case with Vicky syndrome, the ultrasound findings was enough to give us the particular gene in the top 50 list. So like this, in 7 cases overall, the particular gene could be prioritized in the top 50 list using the antenatal findings alone, whereas in 15 cases, the gene could not be found using Phenolyzer if we had only antenatal findings, and we needed the autopsy finding to actually shortlist that particular gene. So overall, in 68% cases, basically, the variant would be missed if we have only antenatal findings and not the postnatal findings available with us. So we can see how deep phenotyping actually helps in performance of exome sequencing at all levels. So it helps us in selection of cases, so we are able to exclude cases which are probably because of acquired etiologies, so that you really work on the cases which are likely to give you a good result. So that's why it improves your diagnostic yield. It helps in variant prioritization, as we saw with the comparison of the prenatal versus the postnatal finding. And of course, it helps in reverse phenotyping, in identifying novel prenatal phenotypes, in finding expanded phenotypes of already known conditions, and also in some cases in finding unusual mechanisms like dual Mendelian phenotype. So our findings also indicate that Mendelian disorders causing prenatal phenotypes can actually be caused by novel genes, resulting in perinatal lethality. So this particular cohort of patients actually is a potential gold mine for novel gene discovery. And then there could be sometimes certain complex prenatal phenotypes which could be because of dual Mendelian disorders. So this again is something which needs to be seen. And then these sometimes the Mendelian disorders, which are already well described in pediatric cohorts, can present prenatally with findings very different from what we know from the pediatric cohort. Hence, there is a need for extensive NGS studies on fetuses where we have performed deep phenotyping, so that we are able to do a more accurate genotype-phenotype association for this particular cohort of patients. And also, I feel there is a need for having a separate database dedicated to this cohort of patients, which would help us in improving the exome sequencing, both in clinical diagnostic as well as further research in this field. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, so we're a little bit behind, but again, use the collaboration corner and then people can come and ask questions.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Dr. Alireza Shehzaz from Baylor College of Medicine, Houston. He's going to be talking about prenatal intervention in severe congenital luto-lower tract outflow obstruction, novel scoring system for determining candidates. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We shift the gear now. Most of today's talk was about prenatal diagnosis, but I would get a little bit more talk about fetal intervention. What I'm talking today about is about prenatal intervention in severe congenital luto, a novel scoring system for determined candidates. Unfortunately, I don't have any conflict of interest. And regarding the introduction, the luto is pretty rare. In diagnosis for the first trimester, majorities go to the megacystic, but majority of the patient will diagnose in the second trimester. How we diagnose in the second trimester, this is the ultrasound findings. They do have a large fetal urinary bladder, keyhole sign, bilateral hydronephrosis, hydroureters, and majority of the severe ones had an oligo or anhydramnios. This is a patient with a severe luto that you can see a cystic kidney. Here you can see a big bladder with a keyhole sign, and then on the lower side you can see the bilateral hydronephrosis. And in general, the luto is a heterogeneous group of the patient. A majority of one is diagnosed in a male, and mostly as a post-ureter valve. We also have a group of the patients that have the ureter atresia, but again, it's a pretty complex group of the patients. In the severe group, the morbidity mortality is pretty high, and the reason of the mortality is high is because of the anhydramnios or low fluid. The treatment that at this point we do have is for the severe group, we put a vesical amniotic shunt, that means we put the shunt in the bladder to restore the fluid around the baby. And the two shunts that are available in the United States are a rocket shunt and Harrison shunt. Japanese use a double piglet basket shunt, but all of them had the same concept, and we put all of them through an ultrasound guided. But what we thought about is, again, who is the best candidate? I mean, we have all of these severe luto, but who will be the best candidate to put the shunt? And again, this is a $1 million questions and how we can solve it, but we come up with some kind of the novel scoring for it. This is the patient. You can see it is a vesical amniotic shunt. You can see the shunt inside the bladder, and then the rest of the shunt is outside. And the objective of the shunt is restoring the fluid around the baby that the baby lung can work during the fetus time. This was a retrospective study from January 2013 to December of 2017. The definition of our luto in our population was an ultrasound demonstrated of enlarged fetal bladder, and that bladder with a keyhole sign or without, and the baby needs to have a hydronephrosis or hydroureter. The candidates should have, for fetal intervention, should have a normal karyotype and do have a severe oligo or anhydramnios. The definition for the oligo was less than a 5 percentile of the AFI for gestational age. And the way that we evaluate this type of the patient is a multidisciplinary approach. The fetal intervention group do the detailed obstetric ultrasound. We do have a pediatric cardiology do the fetal echo, and then all of these patients will see our pediatric urology, pediatric nephrology, genetic counselor, and genetic specialist. We do have a comprehensive assessment of the fetal renal function for all of these kids, ultrasound morphology. And then we do physical synthesis for biochemistries, and we do the degree of the result after the physical synthesis. The bladder volumes measure all of those at the initiate and at 48 hours after the first physical synthesis. And we look at the ultrasound criteria that you can easily see here what we're looking for. The inclusion criteria was a male fetus with a luto, single-term pregnancy, normal prenatal karyotype, and presence of the oligo or hydramnios. And we definitely need to have a follow-up at least for 6 months for these kids. These are exclusion criteria that we exclude the females because it's a more heterogeneous group of patients. Multiple pregnancy was hard to follow, and also the abnormal karyotype is the biggest group that we excluded through our studies. Our scoring systems, we use the 4 elements, is the urine biochemistries, ultrasound evidence of the renal stick changes, initial fetal bladder volume, and the percent refill of the fetal bladder after 48 hours. This is the way that we weight all of these elements. For fetal urinary biochemistry, it's more than 3 abnormal elements, will be get a score 2. If we had a renal corticocyst with a score of the 4, number 4, if our initial bladder volume is less than 40 cc, we get a score 1. And if the percent bladder refill was less than 80% after 48 hours, we get a score 1. And then we score it between the 0 to 8. This is the element that we look at the fetal urinary biochemistry. We did look at the calcium, sodium, chloride, osmolality, and beta-macroglobulin. You can all see what is our cutoff that we did use. The definition of our abnormal postnatal renal function was a patient that did not have a dialysis or the serum creatinine more than 0.5 milligram per deciliter at 6 months of age. We did use the appropriate stat. The result is we evaluated 79 patients with a luto, 34 eligible for our study. After 6 months of the follow-up, about 60% survived, and 24 patients did need had some kind of fetal intervention that was a shunt. Here I want to show that the ones that even survived after 6 months, about 1/3 of those patients did have abnormal postnatal renal function. That means as a general, these are very, very sick baby. And here through the scorings is, if we score somebody is more than a 4, definitely that baby will die. And this is coming down of the N of 14. Again, anybody with a score more than a 4, we didn't have any survival after 6 months. The ROC curves was brought, the area under care was 0.8. Again, 0% prenatal survival with 100% specificity if the score is more than a 3. If the score is between 0 to 3 in our cohort, 80% will survive. And through the strength of our study, again, it's reasonable numbers. Luto is not a pretty common, especially severe ones, and this is coming only from the one center. From our knowledge, it's the biggest series so far that is reported. Again, limitation is coming down to the retrospective type of the study. In conclusion, this is a novel scoring system for antenatal evaluation of the severe luto. The benefit is, somehow we can find which one of these patients is a good candidate for having a shunt, and also is good for a counseling. And definitely the other investigators need to go and reevaluate this type of scoring on their population and see, do they get the same result. Again, I acknowledge my team is a huge team as a multidisciplinary approach, especially our prenatal diagnostic team and our genetic counselors, and also our patient. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Interesting. If anybody has any questions, please use the microphone. Yes, or shout.
Majority had the first tab. We did have a couple of patients we went for a second tab, and the second tab depends on your finding of your first tab. I mean, if the first tab is pretty, wacky, then we go for a second tab. But for the refilling, we only use the first tab.
Thank you. Question back.
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Again, I love that 3 times. That's mostly on manuscripts. Our teams usually do the once because with the one time, you usually can get a more, elements. Again, if we see a very abnormal that electrolytes, then we go for a second. I've never done a 3 tab. I don't believe in 3 tabs. Mark. definitely. And then, we never done the tree tap. The one thing that I good, and the one thing that I need to say, all of these elements, the 4 elements that I mentioned here, they are independent. That means we pulse through these data, these are each one of these elements independent. Spatial, the ultrasound finding, and the abnormal electrolytes. So these are not coming together. You need to weight each one of them differently.
Thank you very much, Constantine. Thank you. So our next talk is 1-PGT for concurrent pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy and monogenic diseases or structural rearrangements. And this will be presented by Richard Cho. Can you reset the timer, please?
So, good morning, everyone. This morning, I'm going to give a brief talk about our experience sharing on how they use this 1-PGT, a total solution for concurrent pre-implantation genetic testing when the body is a monogenic disorder. So, the reagent was sponsored by Agilent. Okay, so I'm going to explain to you why there's a need for the concurrent PGT, subsequently introduce this platform, and then share a bit of the data of the validation study that we have at Chinese University of Hong Kong. So first of all, as you all know, the antibody rate increased as the woman's age advances. And you can see that as the woman becomes the age of 42, the success for live birth is into a single digit. It's less than 5%. Okay. So why is that? One of the reasons is because, like the NIPS study, we know that if there's a presence of abnormal chromosome number, they are high risk for miscarriage. So for all the PGT work, actually what we look for is try to select the best embryo that is chromosomally normal to be implanted. So with that, actually when we refer for pre-implantation genetic testing, in the old days, which refer to PGD or PGS, now it's called a PGT, which is pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy, which particularly we look for chromosomal abnormalities. And we also understand that based on the expanded carrier screening, we do have a lot of couples. They may also have monogenic disorder that we need to take care by PGTN, that is pre-implantation genetic testing for single gene disorder. Or we do also see couples that they do carry balance translocation, that we also need to take care about the chromosomal structural rearrangement. So actually it's a spectrum of 3 different tests that has been practiced clinically or in the laboratory. And there's a lot of data, like we already know that chromosomal abnormalities is increased by advanced maternal age. And the earliest stage study by Dr. Monet, by the application of the pre-implantation genetic testing, has been shown that if a woman, as the age advances, if there's no intervention by PGTA, the implantation rate decreases sharply. But if we offer the intervention by PGTA, actually, we can see that they maintain have a very good implantation rate around 60%. So that sets the stage. That's argued the need why we need to perform all these different type of PGT testing. But conventionally, if we talk about single gene disorder, we need to either do single sequencing or we need to do linkage study using STL marker or SNP for the haplotyping analysis, or sometimes you can using the genotype data by microarray, use the KL mapping. And for the looking for numerical or structural abnormalities, there's a various platform. You can do array-seq, or nowadays there's more common that we will do next generation sequencing. So the fact is that there are 2 separately different systems and different tests. But remember, we're only taking a few cells from a live embryo at day 5. So it will be good. We have a total solutions that we can take care of both PGTN and PGTA at the same time. Why we have this argument? If you look at, there's only limited literature, including from us. You can see that if there's an intervention by either looking for monogenic disease alone or because the couple they're indicated with balance translocation, when we select those embryo by the testing for PGTM or PGT-SR, right, is represented by the bar here. We can see that we were able to select them to be at that stage. They are either a carrier or they are normal by the balance translocation region. But indeed, if those embryo we subsequently perform PGTA, you can see that the number of embryo were normal, were decreased for the blue bar ones from our center is from around 45% to less than 30%, and that is consistent by other studies. So what it means is that even if a monogenic disease embryo is normal, if we don't take care about the numerical chromosome abnormalities, even we put them back, they may end up with a miscarriage. So that's the argument why we need to do concurrent PGT in most of our cases. Right. So a study we look for is we need a tool that we're able to test the embryo for both PGTA, that's for chromosomal numerical abnormalities, as well as the need for monogenic disease or structural variant, that means copy number variant, down to maybe 3 or 5 megabase, okay, so that we can increase the chance of the transfer embryo with high implantation potential. So because of time, I'm just briefly mention about the platform. So this is a NGS-based platform, and why it's able to take care of both PGTM and PGT-SR or A is mainly because it's based on a single cell haplotype and imputations of latent disease variant. So you look at both copy number changes as well as using the SNP data to look at the haplotype. It's more like a linkage analysis in that sense. And it's not really truly a new invention. It has been reported in the early days in HHG in 2015. So basically, it's not very different from the conventional way how you do the PGT. You do a whole genome amplification, you do enzyme digestion. The only difference is that you do a size selection, and then subsequently you go for sequencing. So the determining factor whether you go for PGTA alone or you want to go for concurrent PGTM and PGTA, for example, is based on the amount of outputs of the sequencing data. Right? You can see that you can run concurrent for only 24 samples by high-seq, but you can run up to 96 samples for PGTA only. So that explains the difference in the total amount of data you did. Okay, so with that, our study objectives very simple. We want to determine the core rate for PGTA, PGTM, and PGT-SR using this new platform and compare it with the routine, conventional sign-out of all these clinical cases. And we asked what is the capacity of this new method we're able to deliver. So it involving both donated embryos that have already known to have an abnormal phenotype under the ethics in our university, as well as those donate the WGA product. So in total, we have a total of 89 samples, and we offer for concurrent PGT. So you can see that it includes both autosomal recessive conditions, autosomal dominant, sex-linked case with balance translocation, as well as PGTA only cases. Okay, so I'm going to explain a little bit about what results we got. Okay, just a simple example. I think we are more interested on those cases that we are not able to meet the goal. Okay, so for PGTM, that means they are for the monogenic disorder. Actually, a conventional way we use STR marker or linkage by Carroll mapping, and we compare with this new method, and it's 100% consistency. There were 10 cases that we were not able to have the result. So we excluded them because there's no informative genotypes on those. I will show you in a minute. Okay, so this is an example. We have big samples with alpha thalassemia, and in that region where we're interested, as shown bar here, there's no informative SNP. So in that case, it's not able to be a call. And there's also another 2 cases because the SNP is also regarded as non-informative because they are homozygous SNP. So this explains the limitations of this platform. You need to understand that whether the patient were able to have informative SNP to report there. Okay, and apart from the PGTM, if you look at the PGT-SR data is 100% consistent, both originally done by NGS or by RACTX under this new method. And for PGTA, we do have a case that presents with more like a mosaicism on trisomy 8 that we're not able to validate on the two-cell level. But that is the issue that actually this is a biopsy that we divided into two sets, so that may explain one of the consistencies for this one. But overall, one of the impressive things we were able to use this new method is that, for example, in our Asian population, particularly in Hong Kong, we do have a lot of thalassemia cases, and thalassemia gene is on chromosome 16. So we have one sample actually, already the embryo have a trisomy 16. And we also have another embryo actually is a monosomy 16. So without this concurrent method, actually all your imputation of the genotype will not be valid. It's meaningless. So that's why this shows the importance of concurrent PGTA and PGTM for this work that's needed in the future. Okay, so with that, I would like to summarize my talk. We have validated the one PGT and demonstrates overall hepatocyte coring. It's pretty good at 94%. It's not measured. Some of the regions or some of the disease you have to take care, it may not be report. Okay, it's 100% concordance for PGTM and PGT-SR. And one PGT can achieve compatible results for concurrent PGT-A plus M or SR as compared with reference PGT methods that we use clinically. The determining factor is the SNP coverage. So in our center, now actually we are ready to implement this for routine PGT application. And at the end, I would like to acknowledge this is the work from the PhD student and embryologist, and also we welcome you to our next year's Fetal Maternal Congress in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for Dr. Cho? Can you use a microphone or speak
Perhaps
really
you
loud?
want to shout loudly. If you had a patient who underwent one PGT and they had they had all of their embryos failed, would you consider reimplanting embryos which only failed the PGT-A?
Right. Let me repeat your questions and see whether I get it right. You mentioned that we have cases that we have done one PGT, and then we also look at the PGT-A, and then we implant the embryo. Is that right?
Yes, which had failed the PGT-A. Would you consider if they had no
other viable embryos?
Do you mean all the result is
So let's say you had an embryo which so you had embryos which were acceptable for PGT-M, for example, but they were aneuploid on PGT-A. Would you consider reimplanting them if there were no other available embryos?
Well, I think this is a good question. I think what you bring up is that most of people in the IVF field is about mosaicism. I'm not talking about mosaicism in our study, right? It's more talking about fully complete trisomy. So I don't think most of us agree that we should put back a trisomy cases. Although there are still arguments that we are only sample a small sections, a small number of cells, it may be still mosaic, but at the moment it's not the current practice in the center.
Are there any other questions? Can you comment on the time, how long it takes comparing between the different methods?
Sure. So currently, actually, if you want to do a fast cycle, with our limited knowledge, the only way you can do for PGTA is by the array method, because you are able to do it within 24 hours. All the NGS methods in our hand is not able to do fast cycle if you want to have both concurrent PGTA and PGTM. But I don't think that is the main issue at the moment, because most of us are doing frozen cycle embryo transfer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our last speaker before the break is Suzanne Salveld from Maastricht and Nijmegen in Netherlands, with colleagues presenting an abstract called Whole Exome-Based Preconception Carrier Test for Consanguineous Couples, First Results from Clinical Practice.
Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to present today the first clinical results of our whole exome-based preconception carrier test for consanguineous couples. And I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. To start off with a brief introduction, as you all know, preconception carrier screening or testing refers to genetic testing of couples before pregnancy, and the tests are mainly focused on autosomal recessive diseases, of which a couple can be carrier couple without knowing, but with a 25% risk of affected offspring as a result. So consanguineous couples are at increased risk of being a carrier couple. However, the actual risk numbers are not well known. And so far it was hardly possible to identify for individual consanguineous couples without a positive family history whether or not they are at risk. So prior to our test, some other preconception carrier tests were available in the Netherlands, offered by the Amsterdam and Groningen hospitals. And as you can see, they expanded over the years in terms of number of genes. However, the panels are still relatively small, and they are mainly focused on the Dutch population, or even subgroups within the Dutch population. We decided we wanted to try something different, which had not been done before, namely a broad preconception carrier test on exome data. And this resulted in successful pilot data showing us that this is in fact doable and with a high yield. And our results also strengthened our beliefs that for consanguineous couples, an exome-based strategy is the preferred approach. Because consanguineous couples are particularly at risk of being carrier couple of extremely rare diseases, and they are normally not included in selected gene panels. And also it's not exceptional that they are carrier couple of more than one disease. By using exome sequencing, all recessive diseases can be included, both the more common and the very rare ones. And moreover, it is easy to adjust the diseases that are included and to update them. This is in contrast to the designed panels with targeted sequencing of selected genes. So as a next step, we automated and validated our exome-based approach for the clinical practice, and we started offering this for consanguineous couples in the Netherlands from the end of last year. And this is how it works. So in both partners, whole exome sequencing is performed, and then as first steps, variants with a dbSNP frequency of 5% or more are filtered out, and the data of both partners are merged. This means that only when both partners have variants in the same gene, these variants will remain in the dataset. Subsequently, a panel of virtually all NIM-annotated autosomal recessive genes is applied. And the variants in these genes are analyzed, and combinations only of class 4 and or 5 variants, so likely pathogenic or pathogenic, are reported. And only combined carrierships in the couple are reported. If only one partner is a carrier of a disease, we would normally not see that because of the merging step in the beginning. For spinal muscular atrophy, we so far perform a separate MLPA test until we are able to validate the detection of exome deletions in exome data as well. Here the results of the first 50 couples are shown. 14 couples were referred to us for pre-implantation genetic testing. In 8 of these, only the disease where they asked PGT for was again identified. In 5, the couples were identified as carrier couple of 1, or in one case even 2, additional diseases. 2 PGT indications were only identified because we knew about them beforehand. They were present in the data, but they would have been filtered out otherwise. One because the variant was too deeply intronic, and the other one because the variant had no HGMD annotation yet. And then there was one PGT indication that was missed. However, this was a SMA case with one of the partners being a silent carrier, with 2 SMN1 copies of 1 allele, so this was not a shortcoming of our test. Then 36 couples were not in a PGT setting, and 13 of them had 1 or more affected children with the autosomal recessive or unknown disorder. 4 of these tests came back negative, and none of these couples had a child with a known autosomal recessive disorder. Then 9 tests came back positive. In 4 couples, only the carriership that was already known was found. Again, in 2 couples, we found a carriership that was not previously known, but in retrospect matched their child's unknown disorder. And in 1 couple, besides the known carriership, another carriership was identified, and 2 couples were shown to be carrier of autosomal recessive disease, which was not affected to their, not related to their affected child. Of the 23 couples without medical history, 2 were identified as being carrier couples of autosomal recessive disease. So, when only considering the newly identified novel findings in these couples, the yield of our test is 20%. And one might argue that the 2 findings that were not previously known, but matched children's phenotypes, might also be included in this number because the children may as well have had a non-genetic disorder, and when doing so, the yield would be 24%. So when comparing to the other Dutch panels and to an example of a panel reported in literature by the large panel, you can see that the Dutch panels would have missed all or nearly all newly identified carrierships in these couples, and with the published panel, about half of them would have been missed. And this is not meant to judge these panels as being pointless, but it shows that in consanguineous couples, their use is more limited. So, well, as real cases are almost always the most illustrative, I will present some case examples now. This Turkish couple, first-degree cousins, they have a daughter with cerebral ataxia and mental retardation, for which they requested PGT. And then our preconception carrier test showed that that both partners also are carrier of congenital deafness. There might be some discussion on whether or not this is a severe disorder, but in fact it is one of the most common autosomal recessive indications where PGT is performed for in the Netherlands. And this couple is in the process of PGT for both disorders now. The number in the circle in the pedigree, the 45, it refers to the identical rare variants in the couple. This Turkish couple, they lost their son. He had a severe metabolic disorder, and the couple requested PGT. And then they appear to be also carrier of epidermolysis bullosa dystrophica, a severe blistering disorder. And after receiving this result, the couple asked to add this disease to the PGT analysis as well. The daughter of this Turkish couple died at age 10 months of an unknown disorder. She had severe epilepsy and developmental delay, and no DNA was available for genetic testing. This couple was unaware of being consanguineous, however they originated from a very small village, so consanguinity was suspected by the referring geneticist, and our preconception carrier test was performed and showed a SUOX mutation in both partners. And SUOX mutations cause a lethal metabolic disorder, and the clinical phenotype of the child was very similar to this disease. And the couple opted for PGT or prenatal diagnosis. Compared to the previous examples, the number of identical shared variants in this couple was lower, which is indeed in accordance with a more distant consanguineous connection. So this is the last example I'm presenting here. This Dutch couple, they visited our outpatient clinic for prenatal diagnosis because of a 25% recurrence risk of Pompe's disease. And then our test revealed that they also carry restrictive dermopathy, a very severe lethal disorder. And the couple has decided that they wish to go for PGT for both disorders. So in conclusion, our REST-based preconception carrier test is a powerful diagnostic tool for the identification of serious disease carrier status in consanguineous couples, And in these couples, this test has a higher yield than any other currently available test. And importantly, its outcomes provide the couples with reproductive choices, which is the main aim of preconception carrier screening. And then I would like to thank the people who are working on this with me, especially Amy Paulussen, my lab counterpart in this. And to conclude, the test is now also available for requests from abroad. And here are the contact details. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? So you put down there, I was going to ask about the time to work up the price. Is 4 months the work up from the initial consultation, or is that, what would you say would be the length?
Well, the official time right now for the test is 100 days. Yeah. We have for exceptions we can do sort of a quicker analysis sometimes if there is already a pre-pregnancy and all, but the standard time is.
Question.
Have you had cases where you have incidental secondary findings, and do you tell the couples ahead of time for those?
Do you mean, for example, dominant disorders then?
Yeah, like other genes, because you're sequencing on that.
No, we did not have it. It's also because we apply a panel with only autosomal recessive disease. Okay. And well, if there can of course be genes that cause both autosomal recessive disease and maybe another dominant disease. But then you would only find it if both partners would have the same disorder. That I think it would be rare, but yeah, in theory it could happen, but we didn't.
Thank you very much. So I just want to thank all the speakers of this morning's session again. It was a very interesting and exciting session. So now it's time for posters and exhibitors, and please go and visit the exhibitors on both sides, and then there is a session, an industry-sponsored session at noon by integrated genetics in the same room. Thank you.